On August 9th, 2021, Tesla released its impact statement for the year 2020, and boy does it have a lot of information in it. Let's take a look at just a little bit. Hey y'all, it's Dr. Know-It-All. So Tesla's 2020 impact statement is actually 94 pages long. Obviously, we're not going to go through all of that, but I'm going to touch on some of the most interesting aspects to me at least. And of course, if there's enough interest in this video, I can touch on other things that I'm not going to cover today. But anyway, let's take a look at what I consider to be some of the highlights. So first of all, there's an introduction, focusing on what matters, and the purpose of Tesla's existence is to accelerate the world's transition to sustainable energy. Interesting stuff. By the way, of course, I will put a link to the impact statement in the description if you want to read this more at your leisure. But anyway, so we have the standard, I shouldn't say standard corporate speak stuff, but it is a little bit that way, right? It's just the kind of stuff that you put at the beginning of your impact statement. So let's kind of dial down and look at the more interesting or detailed aspects of this report. So here you can see the table of contents. And what I'm going to look at is the environmental impact and the product impact. Those are the two that I'm going to sort of focus on. And of course, later on, if people are interested, I can certainly look at the supply chain and people and culture impacts as well. But anyway, so for today's video, I'm going to focus on the one that starts at page 10 and the one that starts at page 32. Of course, before we get to the environmental impacts part of the impact statement, they do actually talk, there's a little bit of an advertisement bullet here, right? This is a useful bullet to look at. Basically, that Tesla helped its customers avoid emitting 5 million metric tons of CO2 into the atmosphere. So that's a pretty impressive statement, and they talk about how they measure all of this and what sort of resources that they use, and it all seems to be pretty much on the up and up, and they're really trying to take very good care, especially in sort of life cycle measurements and everything, to really look at all of the aspects of manufacture, of driving the car under different use cases, and even talking about end-of-life stuff and what they do at the end of the life. So I think this is a pretty reasonable statement, and it's pretty reasonable, the measurement metrics that they're using. But again, you can read this yourself if you want to challenge this or if you want to look at it more carefully. And two other rather interesting little graphs that we can look at here. One is just that there's an interesting thing between global and US greenhouse gas emissions. And the interesting part to me is that in the United States, transportation accounts for 30% of global greenhouse gas emissions, whereas globally it's only 17%. But I think a lot of that just has to come down to our agricultural practices and also the fact that industry is a bigger factor in the rest of the globe. Anyway, that was a rather interesting aspect to look at. This is really particularly interesting. I like how what they talk about is an entire ecosystem here, right? So they're not talking about just building a car or just building power walls, but what they're talking about is the battery is sort of like one pivot, one axis of this, and then software is the other axis of this. And that is really, really cool. So of course you've got solar energy on one end, the sun, you've got Tesla's solar power, you've got their energy storage, which of course uses their batteries or LG Chem's batteries or whoever's batteries. But anyway, the batteries that Tesla manufactures and packages up, of course. And then of course you've got their vehicles, which also use the cells and can be charged from the sun or any other source. But then the other sort of axis at the bottom of this is software, and we'll talk about that more later. So this is a really interesting graphic, and it sort of shows how Tesla is building an entire ecosystem instead of one individual product. So that's very cool. So then we get to the environmental impact statement. I think one thing that's really important to look at is that what they talk about is measuring real world data as opposed to measuring some sort of like artificial or constructed version of reality or something. Anyway, there's a definite statement: EVs undeniably generate less lifetime greenhouse gas emissions than ICE vehicles. So I think that's rather interesting to look at. Also is the fact that there are several variables that are often overlooked at by other life cycle studies. A couple of those are, number one, not considering the high energy efficiency of Tesla's powertrains, which is actually a really important factor, and it proves important in the way that Teslas are very efficient to drive as well. But also the other thing is that assuming that EVs need battery replacements at some point in their life cycle, and Tesla talks about how they've built their batteries to last as long as or longer than the automobile itself. And they actually have a graph that shows that for the models S and X, and I assume that it's just that case because those cars have been driven more. But anyway, we'll get to that also. But so anyway, I think it's really important to look at that and to also realize that Tesla talks about this also, is that ICE cars or internal combustion engine cars can only get as clean as they are now. They really can't get any cleaner because they utilize oil and gasoline. Whereas an electric car, if you get a greener grid, so more solar, more wind, more geothermal, whatever it is, the greener the grid gets, the greener the car gets. So those cars like Teslas and other EVs can only get more clean over time as the grid becomes cleaner itself. So here, as you can see, I jumped the gun, right? So they're saying they use only real world data, and the fact that the grid gets greener every year causes EV cars to get greener themselves, while ICE cars are pretty much as clean as they're ever going to get. So I'm going to turn off my corner cam for just a second to get it out of the way, but I think these graphs are actually really interesting to look at. So on the left is an average life cycle emission in the US as a whole. On the right is New York State, which is a greener grid than the nation as a whole. So that's what the source of the comparison is. So on the far right, the gray bar is the average mid-size premium ICE car, internal combustion engine car. So over their lifespan, they emit somewhere around 430 grams of carbon dioxide per mile driven, right? So that's basically what they're saying here. And obviously there's a manufacturing phase and a use phase. So if we look at the Model 3 here, we can see on the far left, and on the left and the right, the graphs are the same. It's just that the grid is greener in New York. So you'll see that the bars are a little bit smaller for the Teslas. Anyway, the Model 3 for ride sharing use and being solar charged, you can see there's only a manufacturing hit. So that's the far left bar. The second to left bar is the Model 3 that's being used for personal use, which would be something that would be more common, right? But is being solar charged only. So the usage phase only adds a little bit more grams of carbon dioxide per mile driven. So it's still well under 100. And if you look at the graph on the right, it's the same thing, because if you're using solar, you're not on the grid, so it doesn't matter how clean the grid is. But then we get to the interesting thing. The Model 3 under a ride sharing and under personal use, you can see how that goes up to somewhere around 120, up to about 180 grams of CO2 per mile driven. But if you have a cleaner grid, it drops to below 100 and to somewhere around 120 grams for personal use. So most likely, most people are going to be using, say, a Model 3 if that's what you purchased for personal use, and you're going to be grid charging it. There's a less likelihood that you'll be using solar, at least not for all of it. So that second to right blue bar is the one that's the most interesting, and you can see how a greener grid cuts way down on carbon emission. And then of course we can see the same thing in Europe. It's basically the same deal, a little bit more carbon emission in terms of constructing the car. I think that's because they're currently shipping the car. So you can see that there's more carbon involved in creating the car and getting it to the customers, I guess. But then, for example, you can look at how Austria has a cleaner grid than Europe as a whole, and so it's less. So anyway, basically the two graphs, the United States one versus New York and the European Union one versus Austria, are more or less the same thing. So you can see how a greener grid leads to less carbon dioxide emission over the life of the vehicle. And then, of course, we see the same thing in China, and this one is even more stark, right? China, it has a very dirty grid overall, but the Sichuan province has a much cleaner grid, and so the right-hand graph looks much more similar to the ones in the United States and Europe, whereas China as a whole has a much higher CO2 emission for electric vehicles. But that's really amazing because an ICE car is going to produce 450-ish grams of CO2 per mile driven, whereas just making the grid greener has a massive impact on pollution. And you can see that really starkly defined with the China graphs here. So these next series of graphs show how the impact of Tesla's powertrain efficiency is really important. So basically the powertrain, which is the batteries, the motors, and the drivetrain getting it to the wheels, right? The more efficient that is, the less energy you use, and the less energy you use, the less CO2 you're putting in the atmosphere. So that's basically what's going on, and those two little arrows are pointing to not the manufacturing part of the lifespan of the vehicle, but the usage part of the lifespan of the vehicle. In other words, the part where you own it and drive it around. And of course, on the right, you can see how the Model Y and especially the Model 3 are substantially better than any competing cars. Now, this image is really interesting. So you can see that the arrows have changed. We're now at the manufacturing portion of the CO2 emissions. And just the change in factory design from Fremont, where there's a lot of movement between each of the pieces of the factory, to the Gigafactory Shanghai, where the entire factory line is incredibly streamlined, right? You get stamping, body in white, in other words, welding, paint shop, then it turns around, goes to general assembly, and right out the door. So it's much more efficient, and that has a massive impact on the CO2 emissions of the manufacturer of the vehicle. And then of course you can see how what Tesla's trying to do is localize their products. So currently they only have 2 auto manufacturing facilities, one in Fremont and one in Shanghai. And so there's an awful lot of shipping going on around the world. But with Berlin opening and with Giga Texas opening as well, there's going to be much, much less shipping. And so Tesla's overall carbon footprint for manufacturing these vehicles is going to go down simply from not having to ship the vehicles so far after manufacture. And in this figure, you can see how manufacturing CO2 impact is affected by supply chain localization. So in North America, 73% of the parts that are not made by Tesla itself are made by US companies, or rather North American companies. So US and Canada, probably, maybe Mexico. But anyway, relatively close geographically. This is really huge in China, where 86% is manufactured or made in China. So these have a huge effect, right? So if you're not having to ship things halfway across the world in terms of like the dibs and dabs, the steering wheel or some bolt or something like that, the less you have to do that, the less CO2 there is being emitted to make that step of the production process happen, and thus the less CO2 you're emitting overall. And then of course, as you might expect, the fact that you can cover these factories with solar panels and you can make them as energy efficient as possible also reduces the CO2 footprint of manufacture. And then of course there's a few more parts. There's number one is transitioning to 4680 Tesla cells, which are going to be easier to manufacture and less energy intensive and costly. There's also transitioning to in-house cathode material manufacturing and utilizing renewable energy as much as possible. All of these things, all of these taken together keep reducing the environmental impact of manufacturing these vehicles. And it's really good to see that Tesla is very much on this, right? They're attempting as much as possible to reduce the manufacturing aspect of building an EV car. And that's actually the biggest part. When you look at it, the lifespan of the car is multiple years, but the manufacturing part of it is very intense in terms of CO2 usage. So every bit they can reduce with that is really, really good for the environment and for us consumers. And this is really interesting because you notice that the little arrows that are there actually show the manufacturing process, right? So it's reducing the CO2 impact of the manufacturing process, but it's the fact that their batteries last so long. So you might think of that as a usage aspect, but basically what they're saying is they don't have to build another set of batteries to put in the car after a few years because the batteries are still good. And so basically they're saying most of the cars, even from as early as 2012, are still being utilized with the same original batteries, and they're still getting above 80%, close to 90%, probably 88% or so of the mileage that they produced when they were first new. So that's a pretty amazing statistic. And it goes to show that Tesla's data also indicates that their batteries last as long as the cars, and that's a really, really important aspect of reducing the environmental impact of these cars, because if you have to replace the batteries, that's one of the largest impact areas, right? So if you don't have to replace the battery in the life of the car, that has a huge effect on the CO2 and energy impact of these cars over their lifespan. And one other thing is how the use of robo-taxis actually impacts the usage of cars. So basically what Tesla is saying is that their software developing FSD, full self-driving, so that you can drive a robot, so that you don't have to drive, right? You can rent or whatever, that you have these robo-taxis that drive themselves around, will lead to higher auto utilization. And the more a car is utilized in its lifespan, right? So instead of like the 5 to 10% that a car is utilized when a person owns one personally, that 75 or 80% utilization when a corporation or whatever, if it's being used as a robotaxi, that means the car is much more efficient over its lifespan. And that actually ends up saving in terms of CO2, and it saves in terms of the environmental impact, etc. So it's really interesting how they talk about their software, their full self-driving software, as an environmental concern. So I think that's really huge and very important to remember. Of course, for anybody who's thought about this, also the particulate matter that's emitted from the tailpipes of cars locally, right? If you've ever driven in a large city like Los Angeles or New York or Tokyo or Shanghai or anything like that, you know that you get these smog days from all the tailpipe emissions. So the local production of pollutants is reduced to basically zero if you're driving an EV car. So that has a massive, massive effect. I think a lot of people don't think about that, but that leads to a lot of premature deaths and illnesses, etc. So that's a really, really important thing to think about as well. And then we get to battery recycling. It's really good to see that Tesla is committed to battery recycling. and I think they're going to be doing this for the car as a whole, but they may turn the scrap metal, they may turn that over to other people. But certainly they're taking responsibility for the batteries, and I think that's really, really important. So in this graph, you can see that if they have 1,000 kilowatt hours worth of end-of-life batteries, they go through the process of recycling and they get 921 kilowatt hours out of it, or about 92% of the materials out of it. That is hugely important. And you can also see how they've recycled 1,300 tons of nickel, 400 tons of copper, and 80 tons of cobalt. And cobalt in particular has a human impact as well, because it's mined in the Democratic Republic of Congo, which has a lot of human rights violations. So it's very important that they're recycling as much cobalt in particular, but everything else as well for the environmental impact. But for the human rights impact, it's very important that cobalt is recycled as much as possible as a material that they can use. And also, interestingly enough, Tesla talks about how they're positioned to do even better with Gigafactory Texas and Gigafactory Brandenburg or Berlin or whatever, that they're going to do better and better with this because of the new manufacture of the batteries and because these new factories are set up to recycle more efficiently. And in this graph, you can see that Tesla also talks about how they use much, much less water than many other companies. If you look at Daimler, for example, like, wow, that's just a lot of cubic meters of water that they're utilizing to manufacture their cars. So you can see Tesla's current usage in Shanghai and in Fremont is about 3 cubic meters of water per vehicle, but it's going to go down in Texas and especially in Berlin. And the sort of dotted little rectangle above that is for cell manufacturing, because that will also take water, but that's a sort of separate process than the actual building of the car itself. So anyway, it's really good to see that Tesla's trying to drive down their water usage as well, because water usage is one of the major environmental dangers that's up and coming, because of course we're getting more climate change and there's more environmental impact of that. And so there's a shifting of where fresh water is being produced via rain, etc. And so it's really important that Tesla uses as little water as possible. So it's good to see that they're pushing that down, especially in Europe. And then interestingly, Tesla, it seems like they're unable to not talk about their EV credits, but of course they manufactured 500,000 cars last year. And you can see how the VW group as a whole manufactured a little over 200,000 cars, and down and down. And of course, most of these other manufacturers make ICE cars as well, so they need these credits. So basically, Tesla gets these free ZEV credits as long as these other manufacturers are manufacturing ICE cars. So this is a good thing for Tesla, and it says that they're putting that money directly into expanding their factories and putting it back into research and development to keep displacing ICE cars over time. And finally, in the environmental impact study, we see this is a really interesting graph. It shows Tesla's energy production, in other words, their solar panels, their solar roofs, etc., versus the amount of energy that they use in their factories. So you can see that while their factory energy usage has gone up over time, that's the gray bar underneath the line, their solar production has gone up drastically. So basically, solar production is way more than the energy that they use to produce their cars. And that's a really cool thing to look at. It doesn't really matter, but ultimately it's a way of them saying, look, all of that energy that we use to manufacture things, we've more than offset it, way more than offset it by producing things that actually produce energy on their own. And then we get to product impact. So we can look at this. This is rather interesting. They compare the Model 3 Standard Range Plus to an Audi A4, a BMW 3 Series, and a Mercedes C-Class, which are around the same sticker price, as you can see. But what's more interesting is the cost of driving a car over 5 years. And you can see that according to Tesla, the Model 3 Standard Range Plus, even though it costs way more than a Toyota Camry, is close to the same amount of cost to own over 5 years or 60,000 miles as a Toyota Camry is. And of course, as many of us EV owners understand, the maintenance and the fuel or electricity is very much less than even a Toyota Camry. And you can see that like a BMW 3 Series, because it's got such a higher sticker price, is way more than the Model 3 Standard Range Plus. So that previous page was rather expected, I think, but this is really fascinating. What Tesla's showing with this graph on the right is that a car with more range, an EV car with more range, gets driven more miles. So what they're saying is that the Model Y, the Model S, the Model X, the Model 3 are being driven as primary cars rather than just little city extra cars, right? So if you own two cars in your family, let's say, and one of them is like a Nissan Leaf that only gets like 65 miles on a tank on a charge up, whereas you also own something like a Model 3 that might get 350 miles on a charge, you're going to drive the one that has the 350-mile range because you can take long trips, you can use it as your daily driver, you don't have to worry about it. So that's what they're saying, is that these cars are being utilized much, much more in terms of miles driven, which actually has a really big environmental impact because, of course, every mile that you're driving on an EV is not a mile you're driving with an ICE car, which means that you're not putting out that CO2 into the atmosphere. And of course, you're not supporting oil refining and mining and et cetera, et cetera. So that's all really interesting and a really fascinating graph that they showed. This is also a rather interesting graph showing the supercharger network, capabilities, and how 2018, 19, and 20, it's gone down just a little bit, but basically it's very, very close to 100% uptime, right? So these stations are up all the time and they're able to be utilized, and that means that you can go on long road trips and not worry about it. You don't have to have range anxiety. So that's actually super, super important to how you can drive a Tesla as your daily driver and your main car. And then Tesla talks about safety impact. So I just want to touch on two more graphs before I finish this episode. It's long enough at this point. This first graph shows the number of accidents per million miles driven. So you can see with a human being driving a normal car, it's about 2 accidents per million miles, or about 1 per 500,000 miles. Whereas if we go all the way down to autopilot engaged, it's somewhere around 0.25 accidents per million miles, or you'd have to drive somewhere around 4 million miles to get involved in an accident. And I think it's an accident bigger than just a little fender bender or something. But still, that's remarkable, right? That's an 8x reduction from a normal human driver to autopilot. That's already almost an entire order of magnitude, right? That would be a factor of 10. It's almost an order of magnitude less than a human driver. And that's right now, and that's without the data for this full self-driving beta, etc. So this is impressive, and it's really, really important to look at this graph and to realize just how safe autopilot actually is. And also how having the active safety features, even if autopilot's not on, are also making the car much safer. And then the final graph that I wanted to touch on here is how many fires Teslas are involved in versus the US average. So you can see that the US average is around 50 fires per billion miles driven, whereas Tesla's average is somewhere around 5 fires per billion miles driven. So as Tesla says, that's an 11x improvement for fires in a Tesla versus an ICE car. And I think this is really important to keep track of because people talk about, oh no, battery cars, they're going to catch on fire, it's going to be a terrible thing. But if you look at that graph, it shows that if you're driving an ICE car, you have 1100% higher chance of getting in a fire in your car than you do driving a Tesla. So I think that's really important to look at this. The numbers don't lie here, right? You have a much, much, much less chance of getting involved in a fire if you're driving a Tesla. And also just because it's a safer car, right? We saw that previous graph where the cars are safer even without autopilot engaged, etc. So anyway, as opposed to the media, which always is casting Teslas as catching on fire for some reason, regular ICE cars are much, much more likely to catch fire. All right, so we looked at the environmental impact and also the product impact of owning a Tesla versus owning another vehicle, an ICE vehicle or other electric vehicles. So anyway, you can see how Tesla has really positioned itself well to not only be changing the future right now, but to change it even more over time into the future. And I think it's really important that we take stock of all of this. Again, I didn't by any means go through this entire report because it's very, very long. But if people are interested, I'll be happy to touch on other sections or go more in depth in any of these parts. So definitely let me know in the comments or at my email address, which is drknowitallknows@gmail.com. Till next time, bye-bye.